10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail to organizational transformation and to changes in society and the world. My name's Andy Pollane. I'm a designer, educator and writer, and currently Group Director of Client Evolution at Fjord. My guest today is Lisa Welchman. Lisa has been writing and talking about digital governance for 2 decades, and she wrote the leading book on this critical discipline called Managing Chaos. She also has a wonderful singing voice and a love of jazz, which makes her my new favourite guest. Lisa, welcome to Power of 10.
Thank you very much.
I want to sort of go back to the beginning. So I watched a talk of yours online, and you said, so here I am at this event. I'm always a little bit sort of unusual at this event because there's no digital governance event. Why is that?
Well, partially because probably I don't want to make one. That would be one reason why. I'm not a very good event organizer. But I also think that digital governance spans across so many different disciplines. And the digital part's really important. So I've sort of cut my teeth in the digital space, but really digital governance is a management consulting concern, right? And because it's so immature, it's kind of all over the place, right? So I could go to a tech event and talk to coders about it. I could go to a UX event, talk to UX people. I could go to a pure play marketing event or IT-driven events. And I have spoken at all those events. Or I could go to a management consultancy type of event and talk about it as well. And all of those players are sort of playing in the digital governance space, but there's no place they all really meet together. Right.
Which is the problem, right?
Right. And that's a problem. And I don't know if it's a problem that needs to be corrected by creating an event that draws all of these people around this discipline of digital, or whether or not it's that all of these disciplines need to be sort of inoculated, right, against some sort of bad behaviors that they're doing that are not making it. In other words, I don't want to create another silo.
So talking of which, I am going to at least ask you to kind of define it, because we were talking before that this is stuff you've been talking about for a very, very long time. We were talking about us both being kind of the sort of old professors of digital. In internet years, we've been around for a very long time. So, and that many of the things you've been talking about feels like they haven't been being heard, or at least being acted upon. So go right back and then just tell me, what is digital governance?
For me, digital governance is all about clarity around decision-making and collaboration. So at its bare bones, can an organization tell you who is accountable for defining and creating a digital strategy and the set of policies and standards that support it? Most organizations, if you ask them that question, they can't really tell you. They'll give you some mushy answers. Well, the marketing department does this, IT does that. This department over here is kind of rogue and does their own thing. But do you actually know who's supposed to define what the goals and objectives are for digital, and then what rules you have to follow when you're making it? If you can, you've got a great digital governance framework. The collaboration part is then, once you've defined those things, how well is your team organized to execute on them? So those are 2 pieces. The first piece of it is usually not done in an organization. So the second piece, which is how the team functions, is usually just way out of whack, right? They're just fighting about stuff and power struggling over things because they actually don't know whose job it is to sort of say what's supposed to be done and what's not supposed to be done. And the real challenge behind that is the culture of digital for 20, 25 years, ever since sort of like the commercial web has been in play, is kind of this do your own thing, throw it up kind of culture.
So I can imagine when people hear of frameworks and policy and governance, their response, particularly now, is, no, but hang on, we're an agile organization. We work in agile. We're sprinting all the time. We have Scrum. That's all the governance we need. We did all that in order to get away from all of that kind of rules and procedures stuff.
I have a lot of complex feelings about what you just said. So the first is, I think fewer people are saying that now because it's becoming very clear that pure play agile with no frame around it can create not just chaos, but a lack of safety for consumers. So I think that's coming to play. That's what we see in these big social media giants. We talk about Facebook, Twitter. That's what we're seeing. It is a lack of policy inside those organizations about what you can and cannot do with people's data. And, development groups just inventing functionality with no sensibility about the impact that has at scale, right? So I could just go on for days about that. But so I think people are beginning to realize that a lack of that is not ideal, right? I also believe that they're just flat out wrong, right? So scale involves standards. And I would argue and ask anyone to tell me, and I'm not saying that they couldn't, but I'm still trying to think of something good, a good answer for this. Anything biologically that we've invented, anything that exists that operates at scale well and does something intentional that is not standards-based, right? The example I always use is the World Wide Web. It's freaking standards-based. That's the WC3. Like, you need standards to scale. Standards also allow you to move quickly and allow a tremendous amount of diversity of things. The example that I use in a lot of my talks is DNA in human beings. We all have the same number of pairs of chromosomes. If we don't, we're probably not viable. But look at the diversity of human beings, capabilities, capacities that exist. And so this argument that standards are somehow constraining or whatever is really, I think, just an immature approach and a desire to operate within a business doing whatever the heck you want to do, which is really immaturity. And so when I talk about digital governance a lot, it's really about, can we mature this? Not so that we can lock things down and control people and you can't create things well, but so that you can create with intent and speed if you want to, or maybe you want to be slow. Maybe speed's not a big deal. I don't really care, right? One way or another. It's just more like getting things done intentionally and safely, I think, is really important.
It's interesting. Errol Balkan at UX Australia did the keynote, and he made the point that growth that goes unchecked, we have a name for that, which is cancer. You also, in your presentation, give this really nice example. You use music to talk about frameworks, and I talked about jazz before. I mean, jazz gets used a lot, I guess, for all sorts of reasons, for people working together in collaboration and so forth. But there's a very nice kind of aspect to music, I think, which is the kind of rule will set you free. I mean, there is music that's just a sort of very, very free form, and it kind of sounds like what it sounds like, which is cacophonous. And if you like it, that's fine. But jazz isn't really about that. Everyone knows their scales and they know their chord progressions and so on and so forth. And that's actually what allows them to improvise and be free. But they also have to do that thing where everyone plays their best, but they also have to listen to each other. And music, I always find, is such a great kind of metaphor for understanding how to kind of work as an organization. But the other thing is, you talk about people, there's a tune, right? And there is a chord progression, and there are some rules and a framework.
Right, and everyone likes a jazz analogy, and I do too. But the point that I'm really making in my book when I talk about music is, yes, jazz, great, I love. I play jazz piano, I'm a jazz singer, I love it. And the equivalent of practicing your scales and knowing your chord changes is the equivalent in the digital space of being good at your job, right?
Yeah.
You just have to be good at your job so that when you show up in the collaboration, you can sort of keep up, and you have to do that. But my point in the book is that type of dynamic is really good for a small ensemble, right? The number of artifacts required to hold a small ensemble together is fewer than the number of artifacts and rules required to keep a symphony orchestra together. So a symphony orchestra needs a conductor in front of it because you've got 100+ musicians. It needs a complicated score. People have to go off and do sectional rehearsals. There's all types of things that have to happen so that you can still have this experience that feels very robust and can be evocative, emotional, wonderful. It just takes more stuff to hold that group together. And I feel like those are the two sides of digital in most organizations. They're trying to function at scale as if they're like some freaking jazz ensemble. And you've got like a digital team of 1,000 people in 40 different countries, right? With, 500 websites, 650 social channels. Who knows how many mobile apps? Why does who know? Because nobody can tell you, because nobody's counting them. And so you're just it's just naive to believe that you can operate like that. And I understand that that is the culture of digital, and a lot of people who started in the digital space very young sort of bought into that vision and believed in that vision that this was kind of this brave new world. But I just feel like that was really naive and maybe a young way to be thinking about things, and that this belief that rules are somehow bad. I saw a dance once by some artist. It must have been some video that I saw on some social media, Facebook, Twitter, or something like that. And it was like a dancer doing a dance in a box, right? Like their space was just in a box. And I have to tell you, it was stunning. They had this ultimate of constraint of a dancer barely being able to move. And it was an amazing thing to see, right? So constraints can also bring about all these amazing possibilities. I was at a jazz workshop with some young people, and it was Bramford Marsalis. I was at a masterclass with him here at Peabody in Baltimore. And just watching the masterclass, and there was this one student who had like this riff that they were always playing on the saxophone. They were trying to show off that they like learned from some Coltrane record or something like that. And, Bramford wasn't having any of it. And so he said to them, look, you can play the solo for the next 3 choruses, but you can only play these 3 notes. That's all you got. It was fabulous, right? So I think we just need to give up on this sense that constraints somehow are going to be limiting or not allow us to do things. And I think the sooner we get over that, the better, and the safer we will be about what we're creating and putting online.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about constraints is, well, one of the things about digital is obviously it's just the kind of plethora of choice, right? So that's kind of part of the problem, because when you can kind of choose to do anything, you kind of end up doing anything. And sometimes then you break things. And as you said before, at scale, at something like Facebook, they only sort of 1% margin in error, and you've got millions of people who are affected by it. But I think one of the other things is that constraints force consideration. Right? If you've only got 3 notes to play, you really have to kind of think about it in a way that you don't if you're just kind of pulling off a riff. You've talked about kind of ownership tussles quite a lot in the book. And one of the sort of fundamental tenets of what you were talking about was, you need these 3 things. You need to know what you have. And I was surprised, and I'm constantly surprised, how often businesses actually don't know what they have, in particular government. Who's touching it and what's the intent? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the what you have is just really a basic. If you don't understand the portfolio of services, products, functionality, whatever you want to call those things, right, that we put online, right? And that gets more and more complex every single day when you think about embedded technologies and all of those other things. If you don't understand what those things are, there's no way that you're going to govern them or be able to strategize about how they hold together, what's the same or different about different aspects of the portfolio. And the other point is, if they are sort of like who's touching them, those are the people, right? And I find that in particular, for the people component of it, it is really shocking to me how little, particularly large enterprises, understand who touches what artifacts. And so some people call it ownership. I don't like that word. I like stewardship better, because the organization owns its online presence and the people working in it are stewards. But people like to have these tug of wars. So if you don't know who's working on these things, then you can't communicate to them what you want them to do and what you don't want them to do. And more importantly, they can't talk to each other. So that's how you end up with a lot of redundancy, a lot of confusion, and a lot of lack of alignment in the digital portfolio. The intent has to do with digital strategy. And so that's the hardest part. When I say digital strategy to people, I'm working on this online training course, and I just finished editing the digital strategy thing. So it's sort of front of mind for me. And, it's really challenging, because I almost didn't make strategy part of governance. But the governing isn't the substance of the strategy, it's knowing who's supposed to make it. And so the intent is, what are you trying to achieve with these things that you're making? And if there is no organizational digital strategy, which basically, bluntly put, is how is this organization going to exploit the internet and the World Wide Web to meet its aims? How are we going to exploit this technology to meet our goals, whether those goals are make money, save lives, I don't care what it is. How are we going to do that? If that's not really clear, then what happens is the intent starts to settle down into business units or into geographies or into a variety of other things. And it's fine. Maybe you actually need some sort of localized strategy, but it should all roll back up into this overall organizational component. And what I find is that organizationally focused digital strategy often just doesn't exist. They think that a digital strategy is, here are the sets of products and services that we're going to make, and it's UX. The UX strategy is the strategy. It's like, no. I'm talking about, I need a business-focused digital strategy. How do you know when you win? So you can have a great user experience and go out of business. We can talk about that. We just recently, Uber just downsized. So I would imagine that Uber has sort of a great user experience if you want to evaluate that from a pure UX standpoint. Ethically, I've got some issues with the company and the business model, but just the experience of interacting with Uber is fairly easy or whatever. But the business model is not sensible, right? So these things have to sort of all tie together. And so I think being really clear about that intent is super important for everyone to understand.
There's a blog post that Chris Sacca wrote, which was an email I'll never open. And in it, he says this thing, something like, because the tools have kind of allowed everyone to kind of build stuff rapidly. He said, too many of you are skipping over the step where lots of smart people beat the shit out of your idea. And I think that it sort of comes to the heart of what you're saying too, which is, there's some of it's fashion as well, I think, which is, we should be doing this, which is the classic thing, I guess, which is someone comes to an agency and says, oh, we want a new website, we want an app. And you say, well, not only why do you want that app, but what do you hope? If you ask the question, well, let's imagine we fast forward and we've built it, what do you hope to achieve? It's the same with the design thinking thing as well. What would you like to be able to do differently, having gone through all that process? There's quite often not an answer.
No, there's not. And, one of the things just that I wanted to mention, just in terms of sort of maturity, because I keep talking about maturity, and I saw a post, and I don't have my machine in front of me, and I'm afraid to move my machine right now to go and look for it to find out the gentleman's name. But I was in sort of violent agreement with him because I've been saying it for many, many years, which is it's still new.
Yes.
So a lot of people measure the sort of maturity of the digital space based on their lifespan and where they are in their career. So before this, you and I were talking about we're the old folks in digital right now. And so, yeah, I've been at this since the year my son was born, and maybe a couple of years before that in the digital space, maybe not web, but working with Lotus Notes, right? And things like that, collaboration software. So I've been at this for over 25 years. But when you go back, and I gave a talk most recently called Moving Towards a Safer and More Compassionate Web. And the focus of that and the analogy that I'm making now is a lot to help people understand where the maturity is automobiles and any technology. If you look at any technology, it takes 50, 80, 100 years to go from, wow, look at this new thing I just made. And then you sort of deploy it onto the consumer and you figure it out real time. So it took a real long time, maybe 80 years, for automobiles to become safe. And there are three components to that safety that come into play every time. And I would really argue you could look at any technology innovation and it would follow the same pattern, which is there are things that the consumer has to do to keep themselves safe. There are things that industry has to do to keep things safe. And there are governmental regulatory things that have to happen every time. And every time, there are kind of stuff that industry will do to keep things safe, but it's really not their main focus. Their main focus is to make money. And so they'll self-regulate to the extent that the world will allow them to, right? They'll get away with what they can get away with. So for automobiles, much of the functionality for auto safety, like airbags, seat belts, shatterproof glass, crumple zones, were invented very, very early. And the only one that was implemented was shatterproof glass, that was implemented early, was shatterproof glass. And that was because people were being decapitated. And the consumer just wouldn't stand for it, right? So we're kind of like so early still, but it's going to happen. Like there are going to be things that consumers have to be, you have to be sensible about your permissions in your app. You can't just expect them to do that. And then, yes, companies have to be ethical about what they're creating and thinking about what they're creating. And yes, there will be sensible regulation or maybe not sensible. And I think when the digital community rejects regulation on the whole, it's too bad because what's going to happen is we're going to get bad regulation inflicted upon us instead of well-considered regulation.
It's interesting in the automobile example that the United States is legendary for consumers accepting seatbelts in cars because it was seen as an affront to their freedom of choice, which is obviously something that's kind of held very dear in the States.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally like that, yeah.
I mean, a bit like smoking and things like that. I mean, in Germany, where I live, every time they've tried to kind of fully ban smoking, it's always been a kind of civil rights kind of issue. Like you're curbing my freedom.
Well, it's huge, and the web is global, and a lot of times the debates are very European and North American centered, with no understanding of the other cultural norms or how other organizations use the web. And so there's really room for a lot of conversation. I mean, the work that Tim Berners-Lee is doing with his colleagues at the Web Foundation is fantastic because they're trying to do this global front. I don't think a lot of people in industry are paying attention to those conversations because a lot of them are policy driven and they don't really hit the day-to-day work that people are doing at their desk. But it's a broad conversation. It's going to take a long time to pull it together. But I just wanted to make that point that we are at the place that we probably just would be. So I'm screaming about digital governance and saying I want it, and have been for 20 years because I'm very process oriented and I studied a lot of symbolic logic, which means when I see a problem, it goes down conditional statements and comes to conclusions very quickly, right? So I was like, wow, that's not going to work. That's not going to scale, right? And everyone's like, party pooper, party pooper, party pooper, right? And so now I'm like, okay, it's not going to work, right? And everybody's like, okay, like so. Maybe she's right. Like, not I told you so, but I'm like, am I right? It's not working like this, right? And so, but what's really scary about it and is really challenging and upsetting to me is the people in the digital community, and I'm going to scarf on the UX people now, and this is not UXers need to learn to code. But in fact, I was talking to somebody the other day, a prospective client, and they were talking about how they wanted to do digital governance engagement with me, but they wanted to just stay with the marketing-centered stuff. And this particular industry they were in is like all Internet of Things enabled or getting ready to be. It's not the automobile industry, but it's sort of like connected cars, right? In fact, that's a really good example because I've worked with a few automobile companies. And they were saying they were basically saying, just let them do their stuff over there. That's not us. We're going to do our thing. And I'm like, wait a minute. This is what's going to happen. You're going to be over here with your websites, mobile apps, and social media, and then they're going to go over there and create a bad experience. They're going to create a bad experience that doesn't comply with stuff that you know is good for user experience. That's what's going to happen. And then you are then going to turn on them later on and say, wow, you guys really messed it up. Like, so you have an opportunity to step out of your comfort zone and go over to that data-driven side of the business or the hard goods side of the business and use your skills. And so I get very, very frustrated because a lot of the UX community, content strategy community, sort of those traditional fields that we see when we think about digital, will not cross over the line to actually engage during the development process or can't or won't, or in some cases are not invited to, so it's not their fault, but they won't cross over the line, but are really, really ready to attack when bad product comes out of that side. So I would really like to see that divide close.
So, one of the things I was just sort of listening to that is I was thinking, is the moniker of digital, there's almost nothing that isn't. I mean, there is quite a lot of stuff, but there's not that many products and services, and by products I mean actual physical ones, and services that aren't or don't have some kind of digital components now. So do you think it's fair to say that this isn't really just about digital governance, it's just governance?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that I always say to people is, if I've done my job, digital governance dissolves into the business.
Right. And so do you think that's one of the reasons why it's quite hard, or maybe there's some resistance to it, or maybe it's not even resistance, there's a feeling of kind of maybe what you were just saying, which is, well, that's not really kind of my job, right? Because effectively what you're describing is the entire kind of business structure. It's not just the digital bit. And do you think that sort of means that people go, oh, that all sounds very nice, Lisa, but it's beyond my pay grade?
That's exactly right. And sometimes it is beyond their pay grade. The only problem is for the people whose pay grade it is, a lot of times, this is less and less because 25 years have gone by. So we have more executives that are digitally enabled than we did before. It used to be that all the executive suite was like obtuse, unless you were a .com business, right? There were a lot of obtuse things, and I don't think I'm being ageist when I'm saying that. It just wasn't in their experience set. So that's changing. There are CEOs that have been interacting with digital as they've built their careers, and I think that is absolutely fabulous that that's the case. And somewhere in the news I read last week that they'd actually made the chief digital officer the CEO of a company. Right. And so I was like, I've been advocating for that kind of movement whatsoever. But the problem is it's nobody's job. UX is saying it's not their job. Marketing is saying it's not their job. IT is going like, we're IT and we do things the same way we have done them forever. Stay away and follow our policies. Right. IT is going to hate me for saying that, but that's generally what they are. We've got our buckets. We've got all the money. We're going to do this kind of thing. The business units, it's not their job. The CEO's like, I'm running the business. Right. The COO's over here, legal, unless it's GDPR, data, privacy concern, is like, I don't care about policy. Right. So that has been actually one of the career frustrations for me is it's nobody's job. And so I'm always telling people somebody has to step out of line and grab this. What it is a tremendous opportunity because it's needed. It's not as if it's going to go away. It's just going to get more and more and more and more. So I think it's an opportunity, a business that can pull these things together and really be comprehensive about how they're doing it, I think is going to succeed.
Just listening to you, I've lived in, I've come from the UK and I've lived in Germany for a long time, but I also lived in Australia for a long time. And one of the things that always strikes me when you go to a country that has, or a city that's mostly grown post-automobile, is it's very, very different from, say, going to somewhere in Italy where you've got kind of or in Germany where you've got these kind of lovely public squares, it's all pedestrianised. And what struck me about, I was just thinking about this, is that when you're talking about silos, and when you're talking about sort of people not speaking together, there's this thing that happens with some designed cities where, or even just a sort of city square or a kind of shopping precinct that's been kind of designed. And these days, it feels like you walk into the space and it feels like you're walking around a 3D rendering of a space. It's kind of artificially, immediately one big thing rather than kind of organically grown. Is that all the things that feel like they should be about kind of, there's a bench there and there's a tree there that should be sort of pulling people together kind of don't work. And yet if you go to a piazza in an Italian city and it's kind of grown up over time, and going to your point of it's still very young digitally, you really notice that difference, that there's this kind of sense of, this is how a square works. This is how you operate in a square. This is how you kind of interact with people. This is how neighbours interact with each other. This is how strangers, these are things that you do and don't do. There's a lot of kind of tacit knowledge of, and that's what we call culture, right? That you have in those things. It strikes me that it's those kinds of rules that you're really kind of talking about, that a lot of the time in other parts of our lives, outside of kind of digital, we just, because they're tacit knowledge about, how you kind of interact. It's that kind of really makes for a good life or not, or a kind of great city or not. Let's say, though, what we're sort of facing in some respects is you've got a lot of people say, we want to be like that. We want to completely get what you're saying, Lisa. I completely understand. We just don't know how to do it. How do we do it in our organisation? What's been your success stories of that?
The variable that is always in place when it works, when that type of transformation works, is an understanding at the executive level. I mean, I hate to say it. These are the types of changes that have to happen from the C-suite, or at least be sponsored by that level. Because you're basically telling everyone, you have to work together. You have to work together in this way. And these people over here get to make the rules that everyone else must follow. And that's just the governing part of it. Collaboratively, you could work in very open and fluid ways, right? When you're operationally, I don't care, right? Like you can work like soldiers or you can work like Woodstock, right? It doesn't really matter. But do you actually have a governing frame of policies and standards so that you know when you've actually left the Woodstock field and you've gone on to something else? How do you make sure you can identify what those things happen? And so if you aren't that person inside of the organization, and that person is often my client, right? That executive level or senior director level person is often my client and has the ear of somebody on the executive team. If you aren't that person and you see the problem and you feel strongly about it, you need to cultivate that relationship, right? So that's the top. The bottom grassroots thing, which is what everyone wants to talk about all the time, is that you can be more intentional about how you collaborate. So you can intentionally cross over lines and get out of your own silo and make sure, particularly if you're in the group of people that are sort of the de facto rule makers. You think you have that accountability. It's never really been placed on you directly, but usually people do the things that you're supposed to say, except for those rogue people right over there, that business unit, that particular geography that does their own thing. Generally speaking, you're thought of as the people who have that. You can just start being more intentional about how you communicate with people about what they should and should not do. And that's bidirectional. It means listening to people out in the field and bringing those silos together. I'm not anti-silo. People can't work in a big mosh pit. It doesn't work that way. You're going to work in small groups of people. It's just, are all of those people playing by a similar set of rules that are maybe a little bit localized to what they are doing, or are they just all inventing their own stuff, right? And so even if you don't have executive support, you can start working on that. A lot of times the problem is the person who's most annoyed by things. Like, I think that there's been such a focus on execution and building things and putting them up quickly that the idea that you actually have to enable people to follow the rules you want them to follow has been forgotten. So, right, you have to, that takes time, and it's not just training. It's about cultivating an internal community of practice so that people are talking about these things together outside of a project. Right? Are you just talking about digital and what it means and sort of your value system around it, sharing new ideas? This geography down here did something really cool. Well, instead of getting upset about it, can you talk to them and bring it into the community? So there's all kinds of behaviors that you can cultivate to bring this sense of togetherness around digital and bring things together, even if you don't have executives that are enabling you to create a more formal digital governance framework.
So I've noticed that we've been talking about with a lot of metaphors and analogies, and that's often a sign that we just don't have the vocabulary to talk about the actual thing we're talking about. And I can imagine someone listening to this and go, well, I kind of get it, but it's all sounding a little bit abstract. What does that stuff sort of concretely look like when you're talking about people working together or people being intentional? How does that manifest tangibly?
Well, I mean, I can be very concrete, and I try not to be because people get scared when I am.
Go on. I won't be scared.
Well, so I talked about it at the top when you were asking me about definitions. So I'll talk about two things. I'll talk about the three things that need to be in place, which are clear decision-making about strategy, policies, and standards, and a process for implementing those things. So that's very easy. We know how to do that. I mean, the thing that makes me crazy about all of this is not crazy stuff. Every enterprise has strategy, policies, and standards. They might call them different things, but they have them, and they have processes for implementing them. People just don't think that digital goes along with that. Digital's freeform, right? And so creating a set of rules for digital is really easy. I mean, there are design standards, there are editorial standards, there are publishing and development standards, and there's network and server infrastructure standards for digital. That's the range of standards for the digital space. Can we write them down and effectively communicate them to the full team? Same thing for policy. There's a range of policies. It's not just GDPR and data privacy. It's a lot of other things. There's social media policy. There's privacy around children. That depending on what your business, there's regulatory policy that comes in. Creating a strategy that has a qualitative cultural component, which is that kind of mouthfeel soft stuff, as well as a quantitative component that has performance measures so we know when we've actually been successful. These are things that people can do, right? The problem is they don't do them because nobody knows who's supposed to do them, or when somebody tries to do them without the authority of executives, they get pushback. Well, why are you telling me what to do? You're not the rule maker. So that's how you make a governing framework. Now, the collaboration component, which is being intentional around it, has to do with digital team structures. And in my book, I talk a lot about teams. And the team, I should have written a whole book about teams. In my mind, there are four components to a team. There is the core. Those are the rule makers and the enablers. So those are the people who are creating the strategies, policy, standards, and they are standing up the technologies, processes, pattern libraries that need to be in place so that everybody else can do it. That is the core. Then you've got your distributed team, which is everybody else in the organization that's making digital stuff, but not rule makers. That's a huge component. These are all the people social media moderating, putting up content or whatever. So this isn't a process bottleneck. This isn't like the core has to review everything. They're just saying this is the framework of rules, and I'm going to set up the technologies to enable you and processes to enable you to follow these rules. It might be setting up a CMS or whatever. The distributed team does that. There you go. Then there's the third level of teams, which is working groups and councils, which is really about how do you get collaboration clicking. There's 3 levels of that. There's a strategic level, which involves executives and senior digital thinkers, where they're collaborating to figure out what that strategy should be and making sure that it's connected to the business. There's a middle working tier, which is the leadership of the core team, along with key stakeholders. Like every enterprise has people in their distributed team that are really important. Maybe it's a big market. Maybe it's a whatever, however you might define that. These are the people that you're going to talk to get input from so that the strategies, policies, and standards that you are creating are actually holistic and make sense for the entire business, right? So you're not creating standards in a silo. So that's your working level. And then your bottom level is the thing that I already mentioned, which is community of practice. And that's anybody who sort of exists in the digital world, wants to know what's going on. Maybe you want to have brown bags. Here's some cool new ideas. Andy's going to come in and talk about whatever over lunch. Anybody can come. Oh, look what this unit did over here. Let's talk about it. Oh, I'd like to report out to you that we're going to have a redesign in 2021. And in 2020, we're going to be doing this. And here's our expectations about what you're going to need to do so that you can plan and budget for it. So there's nothing really real happening in terms of stuff, but it's this communication tier or whatever. And then the last component of the team, and the most ignored, is your extended team. And those are people who impact your digital footprint in a serious way who are outside of your business. That could be your digital agency of record. It could be those crazy little vendors that Australia always hires to do out-of-compliant website development, right? It could be, or whatever. You know, I'm being biased, but you've lived in both of these places. When I work with people, if there is an out-of-control geography, many times it's Australia. And if there is a geography, and if there is a geography that is ahead of everybody else in organization, including being ahead of corporate, it's Germany. Right? It's like, those Germans, they're so together, right? They're making us crazy. They're better than we are. But anyhow.
You know, if you put together the kind of relaxedness of the Australians and the efficiency of the Germans.
You'd have Nirvana.
You get the Danes, right? The Danes and the Dutch.
You're right. I like the Dutch. I like the Dutch a lot. But this extended group is external vendors, but it's also any sort of regulatory bodies or other kind of weird bodies that you have to pay attention if you're in the financial sector. There's certain things that you have to follow. So a lot of people, if I say, who's in your core, who's your distributed team, how do you collaborate with working groups and councils, and who's on your extended team, they're like, So if you can't tell me who your external vendors are, how are they supposed to know what rules they're supposed to follow when they build stuff for you? It's just crazy.
It's one of the things that, I mean, almost everyone I know who's done a lot of work in sort of digital government, not governance, but like Lisa Reichelt and all the sort of GDS people, and says, you know, when they get a department to start having a look at how many domains they have and different websites, there's just hundreds and hundreds of them. They just don't know. But it's not what you're saying is not just what are the assets that you have. It's everything else. It's the complete ecosystem, which speaks to my service design heart. But I've got a question for you, and I'm going to ask it by telling you a story.
Okay.
So my brother, he used to be the circular economy researcher at British Telecom, and one of the things he was doing when they were trying to make the latest router they have more sustainable, he was looking at all the different savings you could make, and he said, "Why is the cable that comes with your router?" Your cables at modem, why is it 2 meters long? Because when I go to people's houses, it's all bundled up behind their things because it's Wi-Fi now. And someone just went, well, it's in the spec. And it's like, okay, who wrote the spec? And he finally tracked it down. And do you remember when you used to, the phone company used to come and they used to put the phone jack at the closest point to the boundary of the house, and it was almost always next to the front door. And then you used to have a little alcove in your hallway with a table, which is what your telephone was on, and you used to make phone calls standing at the alcove. And some engineers in the 60s, I think, had measured the sort of average distance between the door and the alcove, and it was a couple of meters. So that's why it's in the spec, and it hadn't changed. The upshot of that was that he said, if you make it like half a metre, it's better for people because they're not bundling it up behind their phones, but you save enough virgin copper to make a cable that would go halfway around the Earth. So my question for you is, how do you prevent standards and policies becoming fossilised or becoming out of date? How do you ensure there's a kind of return mechanism usually from that kind of that grassroots level, usually from people sort of working at the coalface?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I have an answer for that, and it's in my book. There's a sort of standards life cycle, and there are multiple steps to it: define, disseminate, implement, and measure. And so that's really focused on defining what the standard is, implementing it, which is actually really quite interesting, but not what you asked me about, but I'll just mention it in passing, which is, a lot of people like to write standards, and then it's funny because they're often design people, and they make really interesting design book type things, make them in a PDF and throw them on a intranet somewhere, but they don't actually implement the standard, which is making it possible for people to follow it, which is what you want to do. So that's implementing it, and then disseminating it, implementing it, and then measuring its effectiveness. Then, because it goes in a wheel, what you need to bake into that is, how often should this standard be reviewed? Right? Part of the standard should be, how often should we review this standard? You can't do it all the time. Is it yearly? Is it every 10 years? Every 5 years? Is there a trigger for the standards review? And actually putting processes and systems in place so that those things are done. I talk about a lot in my book that there should be policy stewards and standard stewards. And it is their job to work that life cycle, to make sure that standards are up to date and policies are up to date and relevant. It's not perfect, but it's way better than not having any. Because when you don't have any, like the opposite of that is like the Mac dongle fiasco, right? It's not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of, right? Like you can have that, or you can have, I'd really like to, how many different ways do I have to power up a Mac? I've been a Mac owner since 1987.
For a second there, I was just, when you were saying the Mac dongle fiasco, I was thinking, this is some kind of Happy Meal that I've never heard of?
Yeah, Happy Meal. And you know what? That's what they did with all those leftover dongles. They put them into a McDongle meal. And if you get a cheeseburger and a random dongle. Look, Ma, look what I got. Yeah,
I've got a drawer of them.
A Mac Pro Generation 2 1997 dongle.
You know what, though? If you get rid of them, then I've done this, and I've got my wife's just gone, oh, come on, why do you need all that stuff? And I go, okay, and I sell it all on eBay. And then a day later, and I could really do with that. I just need to connect this old machine to something. So you're saying in your cycle, you've got the measure. Part of the measuring should be, is this going to kind of trigger a review of the standard, right?
Right. What usually happens with standards are that people who are actually designers, and that's either technical designers, any kind of design, right? People who are designing or sort of architecting the experience end up being the people who write the standard. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But they're not the best people to maintain the library of standards.
Why is that?
It's not their job. Their job is to create the experience, not to attend to this library of end-to-end standards for digital. That's almost a librarian's job.
But
right?
It is their job to feed back into that.
It's their job. So I differentiate between a standards author and a standards steward.
Right.
Right? There's lots of standards authors because the standards are really different. Network and server infrastructure standards are really different than design standards, are really different than editorial standards. So there's a whole bunch of people who will be writing those. The standard steward is the person who is running around and saying, hey, I just noticed that this thing happened with GDPR, and I'm identifying that maybe it might impact these standards. Can you review them and make sure that they actually are compliant? Thank you very much. Now I will take them and feed them into the system, right? And you go back to doing your real job, which is not process-oriented standards implementation and measurement, but actually being a UX person or whatever. So you're sort of siphoning that expertise off of the person and taking the weight of having to be the one who's creating all of these standards and maintaining that. That's usually a function that does not exist. And so the weight of it is put on all of these practitioners, and it means it doesn't get done well. So I'm not.
Yeah, because they don't
have time.
Yeah.
That's not what they were hired to do.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get the value of separating those two. I can completely see it, because I'm not a very standardsy kind of guy, but there are also things where I'm really glad that there are some.
Well, so why would you say, I'm interviewing you now, why would you say you're not a standardsy kind of guy? When people say that, my little suspect antenna goes up. So I just wonder why that is.
No, let me tell you, it's not really a standards thing, actually. And that, in fact, my sort of verbal slip there is probably a really good sign, because it's not so much standards that bother me. It's when a policy is kind of dogmatically adhered to when it doesn't actually make sense in the current context that it's in, because it was out of date, or because it doesn't really make sense to the human being and their kind of behavior in that, or their emotions often in that particular context, and that's when you sort of come up against the sort of cold, hard steel of bureaucracy, and it feels like, and I say this as someone living in Germany, where there's quite a lot of that, where you just feel like, oh my God, this, I know that's the rules, but do you not see that doesn't make any sense? Yeah,
and I can appreciate that, but I think in the context of digital, let's talk about in particular what a policy is and what a standard is, right? So for me, policies are organizationally focused. They exist to create opportunity for the organization, to protect the organization from litigation by bad behaviors, by controlling bad behaviors or negative behaviors, and for protecting their customer, right? Safety. I would argue that .coms fail in all three of those spaces and have poor policy when it comes to policy. And almost all their policy is digital policy, because their entire business model is digital. And so those things are very, very high level. And most people who design are never running into policy things. They're usually annoyed about standards, right? Which are rules for execution. And I hear you when I say that, but you don't have to have a lot of standards. People think it's like all or nothing. One way of doing it is to say, look, we have these 3 design standards. Here's a pattern library. Here's a general content strategy for editorial focus. And here's, something else. What's another constraint? You have to use this CMS. There's a good one, right? So there's 3 standards. Other than that, do what you want.
So those are your 3 notes.
Right. So it's just kind of like, that's governance. Governance doesn't mean you need this laundry list of standards. It just means where you need them, have them. You might decide, a lot of people have very, very, very few social media standards. They have a social media policy about big, don't do this, no porn, don't swear, best interest. And then they kind of hire these kind of cutthroat, enigmatic social media moderators and let them free. You've seen it online, right? And so that's a governance model. So people just think governance means tight, right? In the book, I talk a lot about different governing models, and it's not always what it seems, like the benevolent dictatorship that was Apple. You didn't do anything unless 1 or 2 guys said it was okay to do it, right? In the heyday, that was their governance model. But the perception of Apple of this kind of like lush, kind of not free for all, it had a different kind of mouth to fill it, but it was a benevolent dictatorship. Wikipedia, whether you like it or not for a lot of different reasons, is very tightly governed. Like how you can manipulate a page, when you can manipulate a page, the structure of the page. But it's also considered to be one of the most open forums on the planet, right? Because it's got this open authorship model, and people are sometimes playful on it, or whatever the case may be. Another example are military models, which people think of when they think of governance, walking in lockstep in lines. Well, they have an interesting governance model. Yes, they all wear the same uniforms. They're all trained the same way. I use the example of Hurricane Katrina as an example, which is maybe getting a little bit old, and the Coast Guard, and how because of that standardization of training, they were able to arrive and then fluidly and inventively save people in very creative ways on location, right? So it's not about everybody doing the same cookie cutter type of stuff. And if there's anything I would want people to understand about governing, it is that, right? That there are things that they really love a lot and think are super open, they're super tightly governed, and vice versa. Things that they think are the epitome of like lockstep governance, which actually out in the field, like soldiers, for good and for bad, have a lot of free play out in the field, right? So it's governing models you have, and that's why you have to, the subtitle to my book is digital governance by design. It's not digital governance by hammer, it's by design. You go into an organization and you design the governing framework that's going to work for that organization and its needs and its culture.
Rather than just letting it arise out of some kind of chaos or turn into chaos.
Well, it already is chaos.
So, Lisa, we've come up to time. The theme of Power of 10 is actually based on the Ray and Charles Eames film, where they kind of zoom out a power of 10 each time of an image and then go out into the universe and then go all the way back into the subatomic level. And part of the kind of the idea about it, and what I'm talking to different guests about, is this idea that design operates at all these different levels. And I think one of the kind of mistakes we make is to get locked into only working at one level. One of the things that always fascinates me, though, is to ask my guests at the end is, what one small thing do you think has an outsized effect that either is well designed or should be designed?
Communications. Internal communications. I mean, that without a doubt, when you started to ask that question and it was going in that direction, the thing that is not designed and is taken for granted because we all have a mouth and we all have email and we all have Slack and we all have whatever, is that we are actually communicating well with one another. And when I go into organizations, oftentimes, I'll kick things off by a big meeting and I'll say, put all the people who are fighting about digital in the same room and let's just do a vocabulary check and get on the same page. And then over the next week or so, I go out and do one-on-ones, two-on-ones or whatever and talk to people. But 50% of the time when I am in that room giving that sort of orientation, somebody says, this is like the first time we've ever all been in the same room talking about this.
I've had that so many times.
Right?
Yeah.
And so,
that's very true.
So we get to talking, and honestly, by the time we leave the room, half the problems are solved just because they slowed the pace and took the time to talk about how they work together outside of the context of a project. Usually people try to solve these problems inside of a project where everyone's nervous, there's a deadline to meet, or whatever. You have to do a governance design effort as a right in and of itself, not to help support the redesign or the CMS implementation or this UX thing, but because it has value.
That's such a great place to finish. Lisa, thank you very much for being my guest on Power of 10.
It was fabulous. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you can find Lisa on lisawelchman.com, and you are L. Welchman on Twitter. Where else can people find you? Or are those your main hangouts? That's
kind of my main hangouts. I'm working on a second book, and I am not dispositioned towards social media. It sort of scares me. But if you want to find me on one, Twitter is a good place.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Power of 10. If you want to learn more about other shows on the This Is HCD network, visit thisishcd.com, where you'll find ProdPod with Adrian Tan, Ethnopod with Dr. John Curran, and Bringing Design Closer with Gerry Scullion. You'll also find the transcripts and links mentioned in the show, and where you can also sign up to our newsletter, join our Slack channel to connect with other designers all around the world. My name is Andy Pillane. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.